My name is Jake Lawson, and until recently, I believed Summerville Meadows was a decent, peaceful neighborhood on the outskirts of the city of Valesburg. It had tree-lined streets, modest yet well-kept homes, and a cul-de-sac layout that made our community feel cozy. Many of us worked in town, others were retirees enjoying their golden years. At first glance, it was your typical suburban paradise. Things started unraveling one sunny morning. I was midway through my cup of coffee, gazing out the window into my backyard, when I noticed a small group of people filing down my front walkway. 4 individuals marched with a purposeful stride, all wearing matching polo shirts, each carrying some kind of cheap knockoff badge. They approached my door with an air of self-importance that might impress a toddler, but would raise red flags for any adult. Despite the suspicion churning in my gut, I placed my coffee mug on the kitchen counter and answered the door. The moment I cracked it open, one of them, a tall, wiry woman with spiky auburn hair, launched into a rehearsed spiel about violations of Summerville Meadows regulations. Her name tag read Veronica Matthews. She stared at me as if I were a criminal. "You are in serious breach of the Summerville Meadows Neighborhood Association rules," Veronica announced. "We are here to take immediate action." My mind did a double take. I recognized them as members of the Homeowners Association, but I had never seen them so aggressive. HOA notices usually arrived by mail, detailing any violations or dues. This scenario felt more like a police raid. Veronica jabbed a plastic ID card in my face. It looked like something you might print out at a discount office supply store. I suppressed a grin. This was either a bizarre prank or they had completely lost their minds. "We have documented reports of your repeated defiance of community standards," she went on, "including failure to conform to the authorized colors for your porch, possession of an unregistered vehicle, and inappropriate behavior toward committee members." That last accusation almost made me laugh out loud. "Inappropriate behavior," I repeated, arching a brow. Veronica nodded, her fake badge swaying. "Rudeness, non-attendance at mandatory HOA meetings, ignoring friendly reminders, the list goes on. We are taking steps to detain you until we can rectify these issues." "Detain me," I echoed, tasting the absurdity on my tongue. A broad-shouldered man in the group shuffled forward, producing a pair of plastic, bright blue handcuffs. Plastic. I blinked, trying to wrap my head around the notion of ordinary neighbors pretending to be law enforcement, brandishing toy restraints. Veronica's expression hardened. "We have authority in Summerville Meadows," she declared, as though speaking from a legitimate government post. Her associates nodded like they were a well-rehearsed Greek chorus. Little did they know, I am an actual law enforcement officer, city marshal for Valesburg. That's no ceremonial title, it's a real badge with real responsibilities and real legal weight behind it. The moment Veronica threatened me with those toy cuffs, I decided it was time to reveal the truth. I calmly pulled out my wallet, flipping it open to display my legitimate badge. "Interesting," I said in the most measured tone I could manage, "because impersonating law enforcement is illegal, and so is attempted kidnapping. If you truly plan to restrain me." The entire group froze. They stared at my genuine badge as though I just conjured a weapon. Veronica's lips parted, her bravado briefly faltering. "What are you implying?" she whispered, voice shaky. I pressed my advantage. "I am implying that if you don't leave my property right now, I'll be forced to arrest you for real." That was the tipping point. Like a pack of stunned children caught misbehaving, they retreated. One by one, they turned, muttering some nonsense about "this isn't over." Then Veronica, color flooding her cheeks, managed a final hiss, "We'll be back, you can ignore the HOA." I shut the door as they clambered into a car and left. Inside, I was equal parts amused, infuriated, and puzzled. The Summerville Meadows HOA was always strict, everyone in the neighborhood knew that, but this went beyond typical scolding over paint colors or lawn length. These people had literally tried to arrest me. Something told me this was just the beginning of their twisted power play. When they threatened to drag me off in cheap plastic cuffs, I assumed that would be the high point of the day's insanity. Then the phone started buzzing with calls from neighbors. "Jake, what on earth happened this morning?" asked Martha, a retiree who often walked her poodle around the block. She'd apparently witnessed the HOA SWAT team pulling up to my place. I gave her a calm version of events. But the second I hung up, another phone call chimed in. "Dude, are you in trouble with the HOA?" Came the voice of my friend Lucas, who lived 3 houses down. I heard you nearly assaulted them. They said they might file an official complaint with the city. Nearly assaulted them, the rumor mill was in full swing already. I assured him it was just a misunderstanding, that I was not the violent one, that they had attempted to handcuff me. Lucas, perplexed, ended the call, saying he'd keep his ears open for further gossip. The tension in my neighborhood became tangible within hours. I'd see silhouettes peering through curtains whenever I went outside. People who used to wave and smile now kept their distance. A handful of folks, those I considered more level-headed, stopped by to ask my side of the story. I told them plainly that the HOA tried to detain me for violations I didn't commit, and that I shut them down because I work in law enforcement. Most were supportive but uneasy. They knew Veronica was stubborn and cunning. Despite the unsettling vibe, I tried to keep my routine, heading to the station to check in with my superior, Chief Rowland, and handling municipal tasks as needed. That day, I found it hard to focus. My mind spun with the memory of Veronica's unwavering confidence. Anyone who had the audacity to show up at a person's house with toy restraints might not stop at something so trivial. My gut instinct was right. The very next morning, I discovered my trash cans missing. Typically, I hauled them out for pickup every Wednesday, but now, they were just gone. In their place was a typed note shoved through my mail slot. Due to non-compliance with certain Summerville Meadows standards, you are temporarily prohibited from using community waste disposal services. We reserve the right to remove containers and suspend related privileges. It was signed with a generic Summerville Meadows Neighborhood Association stamp. No personal signature, but I knew exactly whose handiwork it was, Veronica's. I leaned against the kitchen counter, rereading that note. Prohibiting me from disposal services ridiculous. Moreover, no private organization could lawfully seize my personal property. My trash cans were my own. This was a blatant attempt at harassment. Despite my irritation, I managed to keep a lid on my temper. I had a suspicion this was step 2 in a pattern of escalating stunts. Veronica was the type who, if you didn't roll over, would double down on her tyranny. Question was, how far was she willing to go? Chapter 3. Adding insult to injury. Not 2 days after the missing trash cans incident, I drove home after a long shift at the city station, only to find a bright orange traffic cone planted in the middle of my driveway. A flapping plastic sign attached to it read, I stared, unbelieving. They couldn't physically prevent me from using my own driveway, or could they? Technically, the HOA had no legal right to close anything on my property. I parked in the street, hopped out of my truck, and promptly removed the cone. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted 2 of Veronica's faithful minions standing behind a hedge, scribbling on clipboards. The moment I chucked that sign into the nearest trash bag, Veronica herself materialized on the sidewalk, her arms folded across her chest. You can remove official HOA signage, she snapped. Veronica, I said, exhaling, I don't know what you are playing at, but you have no authority to block my driveway. She thrust out a laminated piece of paper, presumably another list of contrived rules. According to Regulation 14B, the association can impose property restrictions when dealing with uncooperative residents. I rubbed my temples. Now you're making up random codes. This is private property. The city recognizes my ownership. If you keep this up, you'll be seeing the inside of an actual cell. Her face twisted, but she said nothing further. She just stomped off, barking at her cohorts to follow. Although ID won this minor confrontation, the bigger war was still very much alive. Over the next few days, ominous letters appeared in my mailbox, almost daily threats of fines, summons to mandatory disciplinary hearings, and claims that my house paint was out of alignment with pre-approved color palettes. It was laughable but also exhausting. Then came the phone call that truly rattled me. One afternoon while I was at work, my friend Lucas called in a panic. Jake, there are cops at your house, he blurted. 2 squad cars. They got a tip about some guy with a gun prowling around your property. I froze at my desk. Any day of the week. That sort of call was serious. But in the context of Veronica's vendetta, I had a strong hunch about who had placed that bogus tip. I checked out early and drove home, heart pounding. Pulling onto my street, I saw the flashing lights. 2 of my fellow officers, Grant and Wilson, stood in my front yard chatting with Veronica. She was gesticulating wildly, painting some dramatic picture. The moment I parked, the officers recognized me. They wore expressions that screamed, "We've been duped, sorry boss." Grant approached, looking sheepish. "We got a report of suspicious activity here. A man with a weapon, possibly brandishing it." I glanced at Veronica, who pretended to look startled and innocent. "Just an anonymous tip," she cooed. "We only want to keep the neighborhood safe." By then I had to laugh. "Grant, Wilson, there's no threat. I am the only occupant and I am a sworn marshal. Believe me, no one is prowling around with malicious intent." The officers nodded. "We'll log it as a false report," Wilson said, shooting Veronica a warning glare. "You're aware, ma'am, that filing fraudulent police reports can have consequences." Her face flushed, but she mustered a final haughty sniff. "If I hear suspicious behavior, I won't hesitate to inform the authorities," she said, turning on her heel and marching away. The message was clear. Veronica wasn't afraid to drag the real police into her vendetta, so long as it made my life miserable. She wanted me on edge, but beneath her attempts at intimidation, I sensed a trembling desperation. She had overplayed her hand repeatedly. That night, I realized I was dealing with something akin to a cult leader. Veronica had a small band of devotees who believed any tall tale she spun. She was manipulating them too, pitting them against me. But each time she escalated, she inched closer to genuine criminal territory. And that is where I had the advantage. While I was patrolling the outskirts of Valesburg the next morning, I heard my phone ring in the cruiser. It was from a number I didn't recognize. Usually, I ignored unknown callers, but something nudged me to answer. Sure enough, it was a municipal worker from the county's Public Works Department. "Mr. Lawson," said a man who introduced himself as Walter, "we have a work order to excavate part of your front lawn in Summerville Meadows. It is for a reported water leak. We just arrived at your address." My jaw clenched. "You've got to be kidding me. There is no water leak on my property." Walter sounded puzzled. "Well, the request came from your local association. They said it was urgent." I pressed the button for the car's siren. "Walter, do me a favor, don't dig a single hole until I get there." I sped home, lights flashing. When I arrived, I saw a heavy-duty truck parked by my curb, a small squad of workers milling about with shovels and traffic cones. Over by the neighbor's fence stood Veronica, arms folded, lips curled in that signature smirk. She wore big sunglasses, presumably to hide the glee in her eyes. Walter approached me with a clipboard. "Sorry, buddy. We're only following orders from the association. They said the main pipeline is compromised under your property." I forced a neutral smile and whipped out my official ID. "I am the city marshal. There is no pipeline issue. If you dig up my yard based on a fraudulent claim, that is trespassing and property damage. The association has no authority over county infrastructure, only city or county offices do. So I suggest you pack up." Walter glanced at my badge and instantly lost his bravado. Right. Sorry for the trouble, sir." He turned to his co-workers. "We are done here, guys. Load it up." Sure enough, as soon as the crew started moving back to their truck, Veronica advanced like a bull charging. "This is a necessary repair for the community," she barked. "I have the right to oversee these works. We can't have a negligent homeowner threatening our water supply." "Veronica," I said, stifling the urge to roll my eyes, "this is beyond a nuisance. This is an official matter now. You filed a false maintenance report. That's not only unethical, it's illegal. You are jeopardizing public resources for personal harassment." She actually clenched her fists, glancing between me and Walter, who was politely ignoring her. "You're disrespecting Summerville Meadows," she spat. "This is not how good neighbors behave." At that, I took a step closer, lowering my voice so that the nearby workers wouldn't overhear. "And you're messing with the wrong person." Her scowl deepened. For the first time, a flicker of worry crossed her face, but then she huffed, turned, and marched back to her yard. If this woman was consistent about anything, it was refusing to concede. It was about a week later that I received an official-looking document stuffed into my mailbox. It read, "Summerville Meadows Neighborhood Association. To Jake Lawson, your continued disregard for HOA regulations has resulted in a final determination. Your presence within Summerville Meadows is deemed harmful to community welfare. Thus, we are initiating steps to revoke your right to reside in this neighborhood." I burst into laughter. They literally claimed they could revoke my right to own and live in my own home, a property I'd purchased outright. This announcement concluded by ordering me to appear at a formal hearing or face further consequences. The comedic absurdity was off the charts, but it still made my blood boil because I knew Veronica was behind it, and she was peddling her propaganda to every other neighbor. Sure enough, the rumors circulated that I was a troublemaker. Some neighbors were uneasy about approaching me. Others confronted me politely, saying things like, "Jake, it is best to keep your head down." Veronica S. got a lot of influence. Still others, though, were fed up with the HOA's bullying. They quietly supported me. One of them, an older gentleman named Mr. Frey, told me he had a run-in with Veronica's enforcers over a supposed fence height violation. He was forced to remove the final foot of his pristine picket fence, even though local zoning rules allowed it. Now, with me in the crosshairs, Mr. Frey was cheering from the sidelines for the HOA's downfall. I decided to attend this so-called disciplinary meeting out of sheer curiosity plus. It would be a chance to gather evidence if I needed to press charges for harassment. The meeting took place in the Summerville Meadows Community Hall, a small building they used for holiday parties and monthly gatherings. Walking inside, I found a large group of residents seated in rows of fold-out chairs. At the front, behind a table piled with documents, sat Veronica, flanked by 2 or 3 other HOA board members. Their expressions ranged from smug to downright furious. This meeting is convened to address the disruptive behavior of Jake Lawson. Veronica began in her best authoritative tone. We, the board, have compiled a list of serious infractions, including refusing to comply with neighborhood guidelines, harassing the association, and obstructing lawful inspections. I couldn't help but chuckle. Lawful inspections? You mean those false maintenance calls you placed, the bogus complaint to the police about a gun, and that comical attempt to arrest me with plastic cuffs? One of the board members, a frail man with glasses, glared at me. Those are allegations. We have official documentation of your defiance. Sure you do, I said, crossing my arms. Let us see it. And while we re at it, I'd love to see any relevant portion of the Summerville Meadows Charter that says you can physically remove a property owner from the neighborhood. An uneasy murmur rippled through the crowd. Clearly, not everyone realized the board had no genuine legal power. Veronica's face turned a deep red. She rifled through her pile. Pulling out some papers, she tried to read from them, but the language was so laughable, things like community custody and disciplinary removal. People were whispering, exchanging confused looks. Realizing she was losing the crowd, Veronica hammered her fist on the table. We are not powerless. The association has rights, and if Mr. Lawson can't abide by them, he must face the consequences. This was my cue. I am not going anywhere, Veronica, I said, and you don't have the authority to evict me from my own home. This entire meeting is a farce. An electric tension held the room. Some neighbors squirmed in their seats, others gave me subtle nods of approval. Then, from somewhere in the back, Mr. Frey stood up, scowling. Ivy lived here for 26 years, and Ivy never seen a more ridiculous display of power grabbing in my life, he said, pointing a gnarled finger at Veronica. Enough of this. His outburst broke something in the crowd's collective psyche. People started murmuring louder, some voicing agreement. Veronica's composure cracked. Her lips trembled. She tried to regain control, but ended up hastily adjourning the meeting instead. We'll resolve this matter soon, she declared, slamming her gavel on the table. Then she stormed off. Flanked by her cronies, I exhaled. That was that, at least for the evening. But deep down, I knew she was seething, plotting her next move. People like Veronica Danti just fold. Sure enough, her next strategy was even more reckless. One crisp morning, I awoke to the piercing sound of sirens outside my house. Adrenaline surged as I peered through the living room window. 2 city code enforcement vehicles were parked near my curb, their lights spinning. A pair of inspectors exited carrying clipboards, measuring tape, and cameras. I recognized them as the folks who investigate structural code violations, things like illegal renovations, unsafe dwellings, or pest infestations. My house was perfectly fine, but I sensed Veronica's handiwork. She likely filed a complaint so big and elaborate that the city had no choice but to investigate thoroughly. Stepping outside, I greeted the inspectors politely. Good morning, gentlemen. Can I help you? One, a bearded man with an official badge pinned to his jacket, cleared his throat. We received a formal complaint about multiple violations at this address, unapproved additions. Compromised plumbing, infestations, structural hazards, quite a list. I sighed, gesturing for them to come in. "Feel free to take a look around," I said, mustering my patience. "You'll find nothing of the sort." While the pair made their inspection, Veronica watched from across the street. I could practically feel her smug grin boring into my back. She was probably hoping that in the city's labyrinthine code, the inspectors might find the smallest misstep, maybe a missing permit or an overlooked piece of documentation. If they slapped me with an official violation, it would be a huge black mark, validating her campaign against me. But after 2 hours of thorough searching, crawling under sinks, examining the attic, checking the foundation, flipping through property records, the inspectors emerged with neutral expressions. The older one coughed. "Mr. Lawson, we found no evidence of the alleged issues. Everything is up to code." A grin tugged at my lips, so the complaint was false. He sighed. "Yes, that would be our determination. We'll file this as a baseless complaint." Then he glanced over his shoulder toward Veronica, who was half hidden by a hydrangea bush. "If you suspect malicious intent, you might want to consider a complaint for harassment or the misuse of city resources." I nodded, my gaze fixed on her. "I certainly will." As soon as the inspectors climbed into their vehicles, Veronica came striding over, face taut. "You're overreacting," she snapped. "I was just following standard safety protocol. If I suspect hazards, I am entitled to request an inspection." "You know perfectly well there were no hazards," I countered. "You wasted everyone's time just to cause trouble." Veronica's cheeks turned pink, but she pushed her shoulders back, refusing to relent. "I'll keep doing what's necessary to preserve the character of this neighborhood." Then, spinning on her heel, she stomped back across the street. I headed inside and dialed the city code department, lodging an official harassment complaint against the Summerville Meadows Neighborhood Association. This time, Veronica had crossed the line. She was interfering with public services and filing false claims that mobilized city officials. Even the municipal government frowned on that, especially if it became a pattern. Little did I know, this single complaint was the first pebble in an avalanche that would bury Veronica and her cronies. Within days, I started hearing murmurs around Summerville Meadows. Investigators from the city clerk's office were sniffing around, asking about the HOA's practices, finances, and leadership structure. It turned out that Summerville Meadows was not a gated community, with the broad powers it pretended to have. It was simply an association with certain bylaws that had to stay within legal limits. Residents began reporting questionable fees and fines. A family on the next block, the Chens, claimed they were coerced into paying $500 for a landscaping violation. Another resident, Mrs. Alvarez, said she'd been threatened with eviction if she didn't donate to an association fundraiser that ended up being a private party at Veronica's house. One by one, these stories emerged, painting a picture of a small dictatorship. Veronica had been running the HOA like her personal empire, collecting money and imposing her version of law and order. The final nail in the coffin came when a county auditor reviewed their books. Over $40,000 in funds were unaccounted for, vanishing into the ether, or more accurately, into Veronica's and a few cohorts' pockets. A second revelation was that Veronica hadn't been legitimately re-elected as HOA president. In years, she was simply occupying the seat indefinitely, forging or bypassing any need for a public vote. The outraged members of the HOA board, those who had believed her blindly, joined forces with residents to call a special meeting. Veronica, cornered and short on loyal supporters, attended in a frosty panic. I decided to show up, if only to witness her downfall. The gathering took place once again in the community hall. This time, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Dozens of neighbors glared at her from their seats. Inspectors, city officials, and even a local news reporter were present, invited by outraged residents. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman named Donna Parker, stood up, her voice trembling with anger. "We have discovered serious financial discrepancies in the association's treasury. Furthermore, it appears the annual elections have not been carried out correctly. Veronica, we are putting this to a vote, your immediate removal as president." Veronica's eyes blazed. She tried to launch into a rant about how the investigation was a setup and how the association needed her strict leadership. But at that point, nobody was buying it. Even her longtime sidekicks shrank away, unwilling to defend outright fraud. The board voted unanimously to remove her from her position. As soon as the result was announced, an uproar of applause and angry jeers burst forth. Veronica leapt to her feet, threatening to sue everyone in the room. But the more she screamed, the more people shook their heads, fed up with her theatrics. Then the local police, who'd been alerted to the possible financial crimes, stepped forward. 2 uniformed officers approached the dais where Veronica stood in full meltdown. They explained she was under investigation for embezzlement, fraud, and possibly other charges enough to justify taking her in for questioning. She tried to dodge them, but they stepped around her, guiding her arms gently behind her back. Real handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, no plastic fakes this time. A hush fell, followed by someone letting out a loud, triumphant laugh. I saw Mr. Frey wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. The sight of Veronica, self-appointed tyrant of Summerville Meadows, being escorted away as a suspect was more poetic justice than anyone could have hoped for. With Veronica gone, the HOA fell into a state of frantic reorganization. They elected a temporary board, canceled a slew of bogus fines, and began drafting new guidelines that actually aligned with city regulations. A wave of relief washed over the neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, I learned Veronica had tried to fight the criminal charges, claiming she'd only had the best intentions for Summerville Meadows. The courts weren't as sympathetic. She ended up selling her house to pay legal fees and quietly moved out of Vailsburg. Rumor had it she slunk off to some distant town, presumably to start over. I wouldn't have been surprised if she was already eyeing a new HOA to dominate, but that was no longer my concern. A few weeks after that, I pulled into my driveway and noticed something new, a large for sale sign with a bright sold sticker stuck on top, planted on Veronica's old lawn across the street. A flurry of neighbors came by later that day, beaming with relief. The replacement board members apologized to me personally for the harassment, handing me a letter officially rescinding all bogus notices. I assured them I held no grudges. Summerville Meadows was on the mend, and hopefully, the new leadership would learn from Veronica's abuses of power. Strangely, life in Summerville Meadows felt almost too quiet. No more random letters, no more stealth photography from behind the bushes, and no more nighttime sirens courtesy of Veronica's false reports. I occasionally found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her glaring from across the street. But she was long gone. The neighborhood was now in a rare era of unity. Residents who once kept to themselves began participating in genuine, positive community projects like replanting flowers in the shared garden or organizing a fun block party to celebrate. The new HOA allowed for personal freedoms, only stepping in when an actual issue arose. And they treated me, a sworn city marshal, with the respect any neighbor deserves. One sunny afternoon, as I grilled burgers in my backyard, I remembered how this entire saga began. A group of clueless busybodies in matching polo shirts, brandishing toy badges, convinced they had the power to arrest me. The memory still made me laugh. All in all, I guess Veronica's downfall served as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority. Give someone a scrap of power, especially someone who's hungry for control, and they might push it to absurd limits. But push far enough and they risk toppling off the cliff themselves. To this day, Summerville Meadows remains a peaceful suburb of Vailsburg. Gone are the days of sham fines and plastic handcuffs. In their place, we have genuine neighborly cooperation. It's almost funny how something so tumultuous ended up binding the community together. And in the aftermath of the worst HOA fiasco I've ever seen, I'm more than happy to remain exactly where I am, home, safe, and free from tyranny. That is the story of how a self-appointed neighborhood dictator learned the hard way that real authority isn't something you can fake, and that if you choose to harass the wrong person, justice has a way of catching up to you. Summerville Meadows might have lost an overzealous leader, but it gained a renewed sense of unity and respect. Peace can return. Even after the greatest storm, sometimes it just takes a little push. Thank you for reading this epic tale on the Epic Stories channel. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, subscribe for more incredible sagas, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences with outrageous HOAs. We'd love to hear your stories.